Ed Sullivan stood in his office at CBS, holding a telegram that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was February 4th, 1959, and the message was brief. Buddy Holly killed in plane crash, stop all aboard, dead stop. Ed's hands trembled as he read the words again. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had personally canceled Buddy's scheduled appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, a decision that had kept Buddy in New York instead of sending him on the tour that ended in tragedy. Ed thought he had saved Buddy Holly's life. Instead, he had only delayed the inevitable by 21 days. Before you hear this heartbreaking story, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to witness is the most tragic what-if in Ed Sullivan Show history. To understand Ed Sullivan's agonizing guilt about Buddy Holly's death, you need to understand their relationship. Buddy Holly had appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show twice, first in December 1957, and again in January 1958. Both appearances had been successful, introducing Buddy's unique sound to mainstream America, and helping establish him as one of the brightest young stars in rock and roll. Ed had genuine affection for Buddy. Unlike some of the wild, unpredictable rock performers Ed had dealt with, Buddy was professional, respectful, and genuinely talented. He could write songs, play guitar with remarkable skill, and had a distinctive voice that could handle both rock energy and tender ballads. That Holly boy has something special, Ed had told his producers after Buddy's second appearance. He's not just another rock and roller, he's a real musician, a songwriter. He's going to be around for a long time. By late 1958, Buddy was riding high on hits like That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, and Oh Boy. His career was soaring, but he was also facing financial pressures. His manager had mismanaged his money. His royalties were tied up in legal disputes, and he needed cash to support his new wife, Maria Elena, and their expected child. The Winter Dance Party Tour was supposed to solve Buddy's financial problems. It was a grueling 3-week bus tour through the Midwest in the dead of winter, featuring Buddy, Ritchie Valens, J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, and other performers. The pay was good, but the conditions were brutal, traveling hundreds of miles between shows in an unheated bus during one of the coldest winters on record. Ed Sullivan's office received a call from Buddy's booking agent in mid-January 1959. "Sullivan, we'd like to get Buddy Holly back on your show. He's available January 25th, right in the middle of his tour. We could fly him in from the Midwest for the Sunday show. Then he could rejoin the tour." Ed was interested. Buddy's records were climbing the charts, and Ed knew his audience enjoyed Buddy's performances. But something about the logistics troubled him. Where exactly would he be coming from? Ed asked. "The tour will be in Minnesota that weekend. We'd fly him from Minneapolis to New York Saturday night, do your show Sunday, then fly him back to rejoin the tour in Iowa on Monday." Ed frowned. Flying in winter weather, especially in and out of small Midwest airports, was risky business in 1959. Commercial aviation was still relatively primitive, and weather could ground flights for days. "What if the weather's bad? What if flights are canceled? We'll make it work," the agent assured him. "Buddy needs this exposure and the money. He's having some financial difficulties." Ed made a decision that seemed routine at the time, but would torment him forever. "No," he said. "Too risky. If Buddy gets stranded by weather, it creates problems for his tour and for our show. Let's wait until he's done with this tour, then book him for a regular appearance." The agent was disappointed but understood. "Maybe in March after the tour ends." "March sounds perfect," Ed agreed. "Tell Buddy I'm looking forward to having him back on the show." That conversation took place on January 15th in 1959. Exactly 18 days later, Buddy Holly would be dead. The Winter Dance Party Tour proceeded as planned, but it was a nightmare from the beginning. The bus was old and poorly heated, breaking down repeatedly in sub-zero temperatures. The performers were getting sick, audiences were smaller than expected due to the brutal weather, and the financial returns were disappointing. Meanwhile, Buddy was struggling with more than just the brutal tour conditions. His marriage to Maria Elena was still new. They'd been married less than 6 months, and she was pregnant with their first child. Buddy felt tremendous pressure to provide for his growing family, but his financial situation was precarious due to management disputes and frozen royalties. "I need this tour money," Buddy told his band members during one of their freezing bus rides between venues. "Maria's pregnant, we've got bills, and the lawyers are still fighting over my royalties. I can't afford to cancel any shows." The other performers on the tour, Ritchie Valens, who was just 17 years old, and JP the Big Bopper Richardson, who was 28 and also trying to support a young family, were dealing with similar pressures. They were all young men trying to make it in a brutal industry, playing for small crowds in freezing venues while traveling in conditions that would be considered inhumane today. On February 2, 1959, Ed was working late in his office when his assistant brought him a newspaper clipping. "Mr. Sullivan, there's a story here about that winter dance party tour. Says the performers are having a terrible time with the weather and bus problems." Ed read the article with growing concern. The tour that Buddy Holly was on was described as a disaster and a frozen hell. Performers were getting frostbite. The bus had broken down multiple times, and several shows had been canceled due to weather. "This is terrible," Ed said, looking up from the article. "These are just kids, really. Buddy's only 22 years old. They shouldn't be traveling in conditions like this." His assistant nodded. "Maybe we should have booked Holly for that January show after all. Would have gotten him off that tour for at least a few days." Ed shook his head, but doubt was creeping into his voice. Flying in this weather would have been just as dangerous. At least on the bus, they can control their schedule, wait out storms. But as Ed would learn later, that assumption was tragically wrong. The bus offered no real safety but just a different kind of danger. And at that very moment, as Ed was reading about the tour's problems, Buddy Holly was making the decision that would kill him. Frustrated by another bus breakdown, exhausted from sleeping sitting up in freezing temperature, and desperate to get to the next show with clean clothes and a chance to do laundry, Buddy decided to charter a small plane to fly from Clear Lake, Iowa, to Fargo, North Dakota, after their February 2 show at the Surf Ballroom. The decision wasn't made lightly. Buddy was generally cautious about flying, especially in small planes. But the alternative thus and another night on the broken-down bus in sub-zero temperature seemed worse than the risk of flying through winter weather. Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper asked to join Buddy on the charter flight. Both were young men who, like Buddy, were tired of the brutal bus conditions and willing to pay extra for a chance to travel in relative comfort. The plane was a small Beechcraft Bonanza, piloted by Roger Peterson, a 21-year-old who was qualified but inexperienced in instrument flying. The call came to Ed's office at 9:17 a.m. on February 4, 1959. Ed was reviewing scripts for that Sunday's show when his secretary answered the phone, spoke briefly, then put the caller on hold with a stricken expression. "Mr. Sullivan, it's Associated Press. They say it's urgent, about Buddy Holly." Ed felt his stomach drop. He had learned to dread urgent calls about performers. In his years of booking acts, he'd received too many calls about overdoses, accidents, arrests, and tragedies that cut short promising careers. He took the phone, steeling himself for bad news but not prepared for how bad it would be. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Charles Hardin, with Associated Press. We have confirmed reports that Buddy Holly was killed in a plane crash early this morning near Clear Lake, Iowa. The chartered plane went down in a cornfield shortly after takeoff. There were no survivors." Ed felt the world tilt. "Are you certain?" "Buddy Holly from Lubbock, the singer." "Yes, sir. Buddy Holly." "Richard Valenzuela, that's Ritchie Valens, and Giles Richardson, known as the Big Bopper. All three performers were killed along with the pilot, Roger Peterson." Ed sat down heavily in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear. The room seemed to spin as the implications hit him. 3 young men, all talented performers, all with their whole careers ahead of them, dead in an Iowa cornfield, because they'd wanted to avoid one more night on a freezing bus. "Mr. Sullivan, are you there?" "Yes," Ed managed. What caused the crash?" "Weather conditions were poor. Snow, wind, limited visibility. The plane went down about 5 miles from the airport, shortly after takeoff. The investigation is ongoing." After Ed hung up, he sat alone in his office for nearly an hour, wrestling with a flood of emotions and what-ifs. The most persistent thought was the conversation he'd had with his assistant just 2 days earlier, when they'd wondered if booking Buddy for that January show might have changed things. Ed called his wife Sylvia, his voice breaking. "Sil, Buddy Holly is dead. That sweet kid who was on our show twice." Ed explained the crash, then said words that would echo in his mind for years. "I could have saved him, Sil. If I had booked him for January, he might not have been on that plane." "Ed, you can't think like that. You couldn't have known." But Ed couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed Buddy when the young musician needed help most. The funeral was held in Lubbock, Texas, on February 7th. Ed Sullivan flew there personally, one of the few entertainment industry figures to attend. He sat in the back of the church, tormented by his own what-ifs. After the service, Ed approached Maria Elena, Buddy's pregnant widow. "Mrs. Holly," Ed said quietly, "I'm Ed Sullivan. Buddy appeared on my show twice. I want you to know how much we respected his talent." Maria Elena, still in shock, looked at Ed with recognition. "Mr. Sullivan, Buddy talked about you often. He said you were always kind to him. He was looking forward to being on your show again." Those words hit Ed like a physical blow. Buddy had been looking forward to another Sullivan show appearance. The March booking they had discussed, the one that would never happen. Ed left the funeral determined to honor Buddy's memory. Over the next few months, he dedicated significant airtime to rock and roll performers. He also quietly established a fund to help Maria Elena with medical expenses. But privately, Ed struggled with depression and guilt that lasted for years. He became more protective of young performers, more willing to help them financially when they faced difficulties. In 1971, 12 years after Buddy's death, Ed was interviewed for a documentary about early rock and roll. When asked about Buddy Holly, Ed's composed facade cracked. "Buddy Holly was one of the finest young men I ever met in this business," Ed said, his voice thick with emotion. "His death was a tragedy that never should have happened." "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" the interviewer asked. Ed paused for a long moment. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think about it every day." The interviewer pressed gently. "There were reports that you had considered booking him for a show in January just before the crash." Ed's eyes filled with tears. "I made a business decision based on logistics and weather concerns. It seemed prudent at the time. But I've spent 12 years wondering if that decision cost 3 brilliant young men their lives." Ed Sullivan died in 1974, carrying the guilt about Buddy Holly to his grave. In his personal papers, found after his death was a handwritten note. February 3, 1959. "The day the music died. The day I failed Buddy Holly." But those who knew the full story understood that Ed hadn't failed Buddy Holly. He had made a reasonable decision based on available information. No one could have predicted that a small plane would crash in an Iowa cornfield. The tragedy teaches us that some events are beyond human control, no matter how powerful we might be. Ed's guilt was misplaced. He couldn't have saved Buddy, because he couldn't have known what fate had planned. But Ed's response revealed the depth of his humanity, his commitment to supporting young musicians, his years of carrying survivors' guilt for a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, his genuine care for performers who trusted him with their careers. If this tragic story moved you, Hit that subscribe button and tell us, how do you deal with guilt over decisions that seem wrong only in hindsight? Sometimes we carry responsibility for outcomes we never could have predicted.